Look at any photograph of the Queen Mother from the 1980s onward. Pastel coats, strings of pearls, wide-brimmed hats, and that white-gloved wave. A woman who seemed born to be old, cheerful, unhurried, entirely comfortable in her role as the monarchy's beloved grandmother. The British press adored her. The public adored her more. For the final 2 decades of her life, she was perhaps the most universally approved person in the country. When she turned 100 in August 2000, the nation celebrated. Cards arrived from schoolchildren, the television ran specials. She waved from the balcony of Buckingham Palace, and the crowds roared. There was a bank, though, Coutts Bank, in the Strand, London. And in that bank, at the very moment those crowds were cheering, her account was millions of pounds in the red. Elizabeth Angela Marguerite Bowes-Lyon died on March 30, 2002, at Royal Lodge, Windsor Great Park, at 3:15 in the afternoon. She was 101. Her obituaries ran for days. The national grief was genuine, and the tributes were almost entirely what she would have wanted. Her wartime spirit, her love of horses, her extraordinary longevity, her charm. What the obituaries didn't say, what the cameras didn't show, was what her daughter was going to have to deal with in the weeks that followed. She had spent 50 years running up debts, and for much of that time, the person responsible for quietly managing the damage, for keeping the fiction intact, for standing between the creditors and the institution, was Queen Elizabeth II. The public image that sustained all of this was, in its way, a masterwork of long-form presentation. It rested on a foundation laid 60 years earlier, in the wreckage of the Blitz. When Buckingham Palace took bomb damage during the German raids on London, she said, in a formulation whose exact wording varies slightly across sources, but whose substance is confirmed in her own letters as quoted in William Shawcross's authorized biography, which had complete access to her personal correspondence, that she was glad they had been bombed because it meant she could look the East End in the face. The instinct was genuine. She had refused to evacuate her daughters to Canada. She had stayed in London through the bombing, visiting ruins in the East End with George VI, initially walking into crowds who jeered and threw rubbish because she was wearing expensive clothes and they were pulling bodies from rubble. She pushed through. She came back. She wore softer colors at the suggestion of her couturier Norman Hartnell, reportedly calling the strategy a rainbow of hope, and gradually the crowds turned. Adolf Hitler, according to accounts circulated during the war, called her the most dangerous woman in Europe. The story may or may not be precisely accurate, but it stuck. And it was the kind of thing that sticks because it serves a useful function. By the 1950s, the wartime myth was the architectural load-bearing wall of her public identity. By the 1980s, it was doing work that nothing else could have done. She wasn't young anymore. She wasn't politically useful anymore. She wasn't, in any conventional sense, necessary anymore. What she was, by the time Getty Images was cataloging nearly 2,000 photographs of her taken in that decade alone, was an emblem. The hat, always the broad-brimmed hat tilted at exactly that angle. The pearls, always layered, always white, always exactly that length. The gloves, white cotton or pale leather, always on before the car door opened. The wave, not a sweep, not a pump, but that specific contained oscillation from the wrist, as if she were turning a very small wheel. The smile, and here is what the photographers always captured, held just long enough past the moment a lesser public figure would have let it drop. Town and Country ran extended photographic features of her life across the decade. The magazines sold. The public couldn't get enough of the image of the pastel-coated old lady who had been through the Blitz and come out the other side still raising a glass. That last part, the raising of a glass, was well known. It was permitted knowledge, charming knowledge, the kind that made her seem human rather than remote. The press knew she drank. They wrote about it with affection. What the press didn't write about, not in any sustained way, was what the drinking cost, or who paid for it. She gave the public a grandmother. Specifically, she gave a nation that had been through enormous dislocation, the end of empire, the social transformations of the 1960s and 1970s, the economic turbulence of the 1980s, something it found genuinely reassuring. An old woman in a hat who had seen worse and was still smiling. That function had value. It just didn't have a price tag attached. To understand how the debts accumulated in the first place, you have to go back to the morning of February 6, 1952. George VI died at Sandringham in his sleep. He had been unwell for months, a lung operation the previous year, failing health throughout the autumn, and his death, while not entirely sudden, arrived before anyone had fully worked through what would follow it. His elder daughter, Elizabeth, was 25 years old and staying at Sagana Lodge in Kenya with Prince Philip when the news reached her. By nightfall, she was queen. Her mother at 51 was something she had never planned to become and had no template for managing: a widow. Not a royal widow in the comfortable Edwardian mold, but a suddenly former queen consort, with a title yet to be determined, an income yet to be arranged, and a daughter who was now her sovereign. The transition was, by all accounts, genuinely difficult. Royal records describe her as overwhelmed by grief and unexpectedly relegated to the background. That framing is sympathetic, and the grief was clearly real. George VI had been her partner for nearly 30 years, and she had shaped her entire adult identity around the role of queen consort. But grief does not quite explain what happened next. Queen Mary, widow of George V, had navigated an almost identical transition 16 years earlier. Queen Mary's solution was elegant in its bluntness. She simply remained Queen Mary. She refused any maternal designation. She declined to become a dowager anything. She kept her place in the hierarchy by sheer force of social assertion, and she held it until her death in March 1953. It worked. Nobody seriously disputed her precedence at any royal gathering during those 16 years. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon needed a new title. What she was given, or what was negotiated around her, was Queen Elizabeth the Queen Mother. That hyphenated dignity is itself instructive. She needed the word queen to remain in it. Dowager wouldn't do. Widow wouldn't do. The letters she received in those first weeks after George VI's death, preserved in the royal archives and quoted in Shawcross's biography, show her wrestling with the transformation. But the wrestling was largely private. The external presentation, the decision about how to inhabit the new position, was made quickly and held firm for 5 decades. She moved into Clarence House in 1953. She maintained Burke Hall on the Balmoral estate in Scotland. She accepted Royal Lodge at Windsor as a weekend and holiday retreat. She bought the Castle of May, a crumbling castle on the Caithness coast of northern Scotland, in 1952, from Captain Imbert Terry, at her own expense, and spent 3 years funding its renovation personally. That last detail is worth noting. She chose to purchase and rehabilitate an additional property at the very moment she was transitioning to a reduced income and reduced status. The Castle of May wasn't thrust upon her. She wanted it. She bought it. She renovated it. She maintained it, fully staffed, for roughly 4.5 weeks of seasonal visits per year, 3 weeks each August and 10 days each October, for the next 50 years. The logic, if there was one, appears to have been this. Her status had not changed, only the formalities had changed. The king was dead. The responsibilities of queen consort had transferred to her daughter. But the lifestyle those responsibilities had generated, the residences, the household, the entertainments, the thoroughbreds, the champagne, Those were simply part of what she was. They would continue. Someone would work out the finances. The financial architecture of her new life was established in the House of Commons on July 15, 1952. The Civil List Bill came before Parliament, and Chancellor R.A. Butler laid out the new financial arrangements for the royal family. The sovereign's civil list was set at £475,000 per year. The Hansard record of that debate is explicit about what was separately provided for the Queen Mother. Butler's statement to the committee reads, "There are the items in the previous civil list: £70,000 for Queen Mary, a further £70,000 for the Queen Mother, and £35,000 for the Duke of Gloucester." £70,000. Her own, separate parliamentary annuity. On top of that, the state-funded maintenance of whichever royal residences she occupied, the costs of which were handled through separate departmental votes rather than charged against her personal allowance. £70,000 annually in 1952 wasn't a negligible sum. It was, by the standards of the time, a very substantial income. It was also, by the standards of how she intended to live, completely inadequate. The gap was apparent almost immediately. Not from any public statement, not from any financial disclosure, but from what the next 4 decades of civil list upratings reveal about the structural reality. Parliament raised her allowance repeatedly across the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s. The trajectory is the most damning single data point in the entire financial record. By 1990, the civil list, increase of financial provision order, raised her annual parliamentary annuity from £334,400 to £643,000. Follow that progression carefully. £70,000 in 1952, £334,400 before the 1990 increase, £643,000 after it. That isn't inflation doing all of that work. British prices did rise substantially across the post-war decades, but a simple inflation adjustment from the 1952 figure wouldn't yield a 9-fold increase. Those repeated upratings represent something more specific, Parliament acknowledging in statutory form that whatever she was receiving wasn't enough for how she was living. Each increase was an implicit admission that the gap between her income and her expenditure was real, persistent, and growing. Each increase was Parliament's attempt to close a gap that her lifestyle kept reopening. At £643,000 a year in 1990, the equivalent in contemporary purchasing power of a very comfortable salary by almost any professional standard, she was receiving more money annually than the vast majority of British citizens would earn in a decade of work. She was also still, by the end of that decade, millions of pounds in debt. The biography of William Tallon, her most personally devoted servant, known throughout the palace as Backstairs Billy, captures the explanation for that paradox in a single observation. Her lifestyle in the year 2000 was fundamentally the same as it had been in the 1950s. 50 years of changed royal convention, changed public expectations, the transition from post-war austerity to late-century affluence, and the routines inside Clarence House barely moved. This wasn't the story of a woman who tried to adapt and failed. It was the story of a woman who chose not to try. About that Dubonnet. Imagine Clarence House at noon on any ordinary weekday in, say, 1985. The morning's correspondence has been dealt with. Her private secretary would have handled the formal letters, the invitations, the requests for patronage. The public engagement diary, always full, has been reviewed. And now the working morning is over, and a particular ritual begins. The drink arrives, or rather, it's prepared, because the preparation is part of the ritual. 2 parts Dubonnet, a pink vermouth, sweet and slightly bitter, to 1 part gin. That specific ratio, 2-to-1 Dubonnet to gin, is confirmed by People magazine's profile of her habits, by The Guardian's 2006 account of her daily routine, and by the testimony of household staff across multiple biographical sources. Ice, a slice of lemon. Served at noon, consistently, as if regulated by something more structural than preference, as if noon were the hour when that particular mixture became simply correct. This wasn't a glass of wine with lunch. This was the opening movement of a day's drinking that continued, with its own internal logic and rhythm, until late in the evening. Wine came with lunch. A port or martini appeared in the afternoon. Champagne arrived at dinner. Brian Hoey, in his book Not in Front of the Corgis, which draws on years of access to royal household accounts and staff testimony, records that no meal at Clarence House was consumed without copious wine and champagne. He also documents a specific instruction that captures the scale of the dependency in a single practical detail. The Queen Mother asked William Tallon, backstairs Billy himself, her most trusted personal aide, to pack 2 bottles of Dubonnet and 2 bottles of gin for a journey. Not 1 bottle, not a reasonable supply for an uncertain trip, 2 bottles of each for a single journey. Tallon, who devoted his professional life to her service and who by all accounts adored her, packed them without comment. Major Colin Burgess served as her equerry, her personal fixer in the language the press would later use, and he described her drinking habits in a Daily Mail interview that fed into his memoir, Behind Palace Doors. His recollections describe 1 or 2 glasses of pink champagne as a standard feature of social occasions, with the champagne continuing through the evening. Grania Forbes's biographical material and accounts from her wider social circle confirm champagne as the baseline expectation at any Clarence House gathering. Not an occasional treat, not a celebration marker, but the default. The question at Clarence House wasn't whether champagne would be served. It was which champagne and how much. Modern commentators have extrapolated from the documented daily routine to calculate something in the region of 70 drinks per week. That specific figure is an inference from the pattern, rather than a number from any medical record, and it should be presented as such. What isn't an inference is the pattern itself, confirmed across named sources who witnessed it directly. She drank systematically, daily, as a structural feature of her day. The bills for that structure went to Coutts, and eventually, through whatever arrangement sustained it, to her daughter. Then there were the horses. The racing operation ran for more than 50 years. Across that period, her horses won more than 400 races. 400! That isn't a hobby. That isn't a pastime. That is an operation, sustained across half a century at the level of a serious professional concern. She wasn't an occasional owner who kept a horse or 2 for sentimental reasons and attended the occasional meeting. She was a dedicated participant in the sport, an owner whose knowledge of bloodlines, training methods, and race conditions was genuine and deep. The BBC's profile of her racing life describes the passion as one of the central organizing principles of her later years. She read form. She followed careers. She named horses with care. She went to the races with evident and unfeigned pleasure. The economics of that pleasure, held at that scale, are straightforward. A single thoroughbred racehorse in modern Britain carries annual running costs, training fees paid to a licensed trainer, veterinary care, including routine and emergency treatments, stabling and pasture, farriery, transport to racecourses, insurance, that run to approximately £25,000 to £30,000 per year. At her level, across 50 years, with a stable large enough to generate 400 winners, the sustained outgoing wasn't modest. And crucially, not a single biography or contemporaneous account contains any serious suggestion that she ever materially scaled it back. There is no documented period when she convened a meeting with her advisors and said, "The overdraft is at a level that requires us to reduce the racing operation." There is no record of a horse sold for financial rather than racing reasons. No accounts of a trainer told that fewer entries would be needed that season. The horses ran. Year after year, regardless of what the Coutts statement showed, the horses ran. She watched them from the owner's enclosure with the same evident pleasure in 1995 as she had in 1955. The trainer, the vet, the farrier, the stable staff, they were paid, eventually, through a structure that by the 1990s was being managed, in its broadest outlines, by the financial architecture that Elizabeth II's household had built around the problem. The Castle of May added its own dimension. A fully staffed castle on the northern tip of mainland Scotland, maintained for 4.5 weeks of occupation per year, generates costs in staffing, maintenance, utilities, and provisioning that are entirely disconnected from the frequency of use. The castle itself, whose own website would later note that no one could say for certain what it cost to maintain, required year-round attention from a permanent staff, even when the Queen Mother wasn't in residence. The garden she made there, which she tended with genuine enthusiasm during her short annual visits, required year-round horticultural care. The building required year-round structural maintenance. It had been in poor condition when she bought it, and a Scottish castle on the Caithness coast, exposed to North Atlantic weather, requires continuous investment to remain habitable. She invested continuously. Coutts held the tab. Her relationship with money operated through assumptions that were, even by the 1950s, historically archaic. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon had been born in 1900 as the youngest daughter of the 14th Earl of Strathmore and Kinghorn, into the specific social world of Edwardian Scottish landed aristocracy. In that world, the world of Glamis Castle and its equivalent establishments across the country, the relationship between nobility and commercial suppliers was structured by an unspoken but absolute principle. Money wasn't discussed between persons of quality and persons of trade. Bills would arrive, bills would, eventually, be settled. The interval between the arrival of the bill and its settlement wasn't a source of embarrassment or negotiation. It was simply how things worked. Credit wasn't the enemy of prosperity. It was one of prosperity's natural expressions. A man who needed to pay cash on delivery was someone who had no standing worth extending credit to. Those assumptions didn't dissolve when she became Duchess of York in 1923, or Queen Consort in 1936, or Queen Mother in 1952. They hardened, if anything, because her status kept increasing. The woman who had grown up at Glamis, who had helped run the castle as a nursing auxiliary during the First World War, who had known from girlhood that the Earl of Strathmore's accounts were managed at a considerable remove from the Earl himself, had never encountered a moment when the social framework required her to confront a bill personally, directly, and urgently. She had watched the civil list run into deficit during her husband's reign. The Hansard record of the 1952 civil list debate itself notes this explicitly. The previous reign had ended with the civil list running a deficit of approximately £30,000 a year, and one of Butler's stated purposes in setting the new civil list higher was to eliminate that accumulated shortfall. She had seen, at close quarters over 15 years of queenship, what happened when royal expenditure outran parliamentary provision. She had seen it, absorbed the information, and drawn no conclusions from it that altered her behavior in any permanent way. This is the moral center of the story. She wasn't ignorant of finance. She wasn't naive about the relationship between income and expenditure. She wasn't, in any clinically precise sense, unable to process the relevant facts. She was indifferent to them. The facts applied to other people, to households where the sovereign's pleasure wasn't the determinant, to establishments where someone had to balance a ledger at the end of the month because no alternative structure existed. At Clarence House, there was always Coutts. At Coutts, there was always the overdraft facility. Behind the overdraft facility, there was always, in the last resort, a structure that would resolve things. She didn't need to know the details of that structure. She didn't want to know them. Knowing them would have required her to acknowledge that the gap was real, that it mattered, and that someone she could specifically identify, was bearing the cost. She never, by any documented account, acknowledged that. The first documented moment when someone was specifically identified and explicitly summoned to help occurred in 1959. Sir Arthur Penn had served as the Queen Mother's private secretary for years. His job, in practice, encompassed everything that fell under the general heading of managing the consequences of her decisions. The correspondence, the scheduling, the diplomatic navigation of the household's relationship with Buckingham Palace, and, increasingly, the financial situation. By 1959, 7 years into her widowhood, 7 years of living precisely as she had lived before, the situation had deteriorated far enough to require a step he apparently didn't take lightly. He wrote to Buckingham Palace. The Financial Times, in a 2008 article headlined Queen Mum's 1959 Cash Crisis, describes the communication as a begging letter. That characterization, the FT's own, carries weight because begging letters from senior royal household officials to the palace aren't routine bureaucratic correspondence. Penn wasn't filing a routine financial update. He was describing a situation that had become serious enough that, without external intervention, it risked public humiliation. The story had the potential to become a scandal. The Queen Mother's finances had reached a state where that possibility was real. That letter is the earliest named primary document in the record of the bailout arrangement. Its existence isn't in dispute. The Financial Times cited it directly. What it establishes is that the dynamic the FT would later summarize as "the Queen subsidized her mother" wasn't a late-life development, not something that emerged only in the Queen Mother's 80s or 90s. It was present, formally documented, by 1959. She had been a widow for 7 years. She had a parliamentary annuity, use of royal residences, and a household staff. And she had already run up debts that required palace intervention to prevent public humiliation. The FT's 2008 article is the cleanest, most authoritative journalistic summary of the mechanism. Its key sentences: "The Queen subsidized her mother," and "she was reported to have paid off her overdraft at Coutts Bank after her death, a sum reputed to run into millions of pounds." The phrase, "was reported to have," is the FT's own hedging. The paper is reporting what other accounts have established, not making an original discovery. But "the Queen subsidized her mother" carries no hedge at all. That is a flat, declarative historical statement from a serious financial newspaper, published 6 years after the Queen Mother's death and 49 years after Sir Arthur Penn's begging letter. It sits in the public record. It hasn't been disputed. She continued to live as if she were still queen, often running up debts which the Queen settled privately for her. That formulation, which circulated in royal commentary rooted in contemporaneous reporting, captures the structural reality of what was happening for half a century. Not an occasional kindness from daughter to mother. A sustained, recurring arrangement, built into the fabric of how the royal household managed the Queen Mother's accounts, running from the late 1950s through to the estate clearance in 2002. The question of mechanism, how, specifically, did the money flow, is the question that the public record answers only partially. Elizabeth II had 3 primary income streams. The sovereign grant funded official expenditure, the costs of running the monarchy as a functioning institution. The Privy Purse, funded by the income of the Duchy of Lancaster, provided for expenses that sat between official and personal. And personal wealth, her own portfolio, investments, and savings covered strictly private spending. The keeper of the Privy Purse, Sir Michael Peat at the relevant period, managed the sovereign's private financial affairs, but no public document shows him routing specific instructions to pay specific Queen Mother creditors. The operational mechanics at that transactional level aren't in the public domain. What is documented is the structure that was ultimately built to handle the problem. In 1994, a trust fund was established, associated with the Queen Mother's art collection and other assets. Its purpose was explicit: to manage the tax and debt implications that would arise on the Queen Mother's death and on Princess Margaret's death. The trust wasn't accidental or improvised. It was deliberate forward planning, constructed at a point when the people managing these affairs could see clearly enough that the debts weren't going to resolve themselves. The trust was the mechanism by which the overdraft at Coutts could be absorbed through estate assets, rather than requiring Elizabeth II to write a personal check in the immediate aftermath of bereavement. Sir Michael Peat's public position, delivered to the media in the days following the Queen Mother's death, was precisely calibrated. He confirmed the existence of the arrangements. He emphasized that general taxpayers wouldn't be directly saddled with her personal debts. That assurance wasn't a reassurance offered from some position of easy comfort. It was the prepared public line, rehearsed in advance, available because the 1994 trust had been specifically designed to make it true. The art collection gave the trust its primary asset base. The Queen Mother had an eye for paintings and had bought well over the decades, sometimes with great prescience. CBS News, covering the estate after her death, noted that a Monet she had purchased for approximately $2,300 in 1949 was estimated to be worth approximately $17,000 at her death. A modest example, but illustrative of the broader pattern. Decades of accumulation, decades of appreciation, and a collection that by 2002 represented a substantial and liquid asset pool. That pool was what the trust drew upon. The Coutts overdraft was cleared. The remaining estate, the contents of Clarence House, Burke Hall, Royal Lodge, and Castle of May, then passed intact to Elizabeth II as the sole heir. The mechanics then, as best as they can be reconstructed from the public record, the 1994 trust absorbed the overdraft through estate assets. The liabilities were settled within the estate structure rather than through a personal transfer from Elizabeth's own funds. Elizabeth inherited the net position, substantial assets, fully cleared debts, and through it, legal responsibility for anything the trust had not caught. The circle closed within the financial architecture that had been carefully constructed over years for exactly this purpose. Now for the number itself. On November 2nd, 2000, 9 months before she turned 101, 16 months before she died, the BBC published a business article about governance reforms at Coutts Bank. The article wasn't about the Queen Mother. It was about institutional banking practices, about criticism directed at how Coutts managed credit for its most prominent clients, about whether a bank of Coutts's standing should have allowed certain accounts to deteriorate so dramatically. The article named 2 examples of what critics considered excessive and imprudent lending. One was the Duchess of York, who had been allowed to run up debts of more than £3 million. The other was the Queen Mother, who had been allowed to accumulate an overdraft of £4 million. That is the origin of the £4 million figure in the public record, not a posthumous estimate, not an audited probate filing, not a sealed document that someone smuggled out of the estate. A BBC business article, dated and bylined, published during her lifetime in a business context as part of a legitimate discussion of whether a bank was exercising appropriate credit oversight. The figure referred to her Coutts overdraft at approximately that period, the autumn of 2000. It wasn't a figure someone calculated after her death, working backward from what the estate owed. It was contemporary reporting on a known, live institutional account. The subsequent reporting confirmed and, in some cases, expanded the figure. The Daily Express revisited the subject in July 2023 in a piece specifically examining Coutts's history of royal connections, describing what it called spectacular overspending, and citing total debts at her death of more than £7 million. That higher figure, and variants of it appear across later reporting, with estimates ranging from £6 million to £7 million or beyond, may incorporate obligations that extended beyond the central Coutts overdraft itself. Other institutional accounts, perhaps outstanding household invoices, perhaps additional structured liabilities that the 1994 trust had been designed to absorb. The Daily Express didn't itemize them. No source available publicly has itemized them. The Telegraph returned to the subject in September 2024 in a piece headlined, "How the Queen Mother Spent Her Money," describing her as said to have been overdrawn by £4 million in her account at Coutts, and referencing Observer reporting from 2002 as an earlier source for the same figure. UPI published a report in January 2008 stating flatly that she had overspent her income while she was alive and left millions of pounds in debts at her death. The Financial Times, in the same 2008 article that described the 1959 begging letter, confirmed a sum reputed to run into millions of pounds as the overdraft cleared after death, hedged in its attribution, but not in its direction. The private probate records are sealed. There is no publicly accessible document that itemizes her liabilities at an audited exact figure of £4 million or any other precise number on the specific date of March 30th, 2002. The special sealing provisions that apply to royal wills in the United Kingdom ensure that the full accounting will likely never enter the public domain. The historical consensus, BBC, FT, Telegraph, Daily Express, UPI, covering a span from 2000 to 2024, converges on a Coutts overdraft in the region of £4 million, with total liabilities potentially running higher. The ledgers, as they stand, are permanently closed to outside scrutiny. What isn't in serious dispute across any of those sources is the fundamental fact: she died with a multi-million-pound overdraft accumulated across 50 years of a lifestyle that refused to acknowledge its financial limits. And the woman who inherited the estate, who, under UK inheritance law, inherited both the assets and the obligations, was her daughter. It's worth being precise about what she wasn't, because the precision matters for understanding the indictment. She wasn't poor. She had not been stripped of assets by circumstance, or by economic misfortune, or by events beyond her control. Her estate at death, according to secondary reporting, which is all that is available given the sealed probate records, carried a gross value substantially exceeding the outstanding debts. She was asset-rich in the way that a very particular class of person is asset-rich, surrounded by irreplaceable objects accumulated over a century, chronically short of liquid funds. The gap between the two, a product entirely of choice rather than condition. She had not, it should also be noted, inherited any significant private wealth that cushioned these decisions. Glamis Castle, the ancestral home she had grown up in, remained throughout her life the property of the Earls of Strathmore and Kinghorn, her family, but not her. The income from Glamis's estate operations and tourism accrued to her family, not to her personally. The financial sources available to her were the parliamentary annuity, the institutional credit at Coutts, and whatever informal subsidy Elizabeth II provided during her lifetime. That was the complete picture of her personal finances. Against that structure, she maintained 4 residences. She ran a racing stable for 50 years. She hosted a large household at Clarence House. She entertained elaborately and constantly. She drank, daily, a documented and consistent routine that ran from noon to late evening. She spent on clothes, on the trappings of a public life commensurate with what she believed her status required. The deficit between the two sides of that ledger wasn't an accident of arithmetic. It was the predictable, inevitable outcome of a deliberate decision made once in 1952 and never revisited. That the obligations of her status required a certain way of living, and that the way of living would continue regardless of what the income statement said or who ultimately bore the cost. William Shawcross, who wrote the authorized biography with complete access to her personal letters and diaries, chose the word cheerfully to describe the vast spending and the overdrafts. The LA Times review of his book relayed that characterization directly. It's a word worth pausing on. Cheerfully implies that the overspending wasn't a source of anxiety for her, not a secret she guarded with any great care among the people who knew her well. Those people, the courtiers, the household staff, the intimate circle of friends who dined at Clarence House and watched the champagne poured, knew. It was acknowledged in the right company. It was, apparently, part of the charm. The Queen Mother's debts were something people in her circle knew about and discussed with the same mild, fond amusement they brought to any of her eccentricities. She was cheerful about it. She was cheerful about everything. That was the point. The worry was left to others. The reckoning arrived, in its final and complete form, in the spring of 2002. She died at Royal Lodge at 3:15 on the afternoon of March 30th. She had slipped at Sandringham in February, recovered sufficiently to be moved to Windsor, and died in the week before Easter. The announcement went out that afternoon. The flag at Buckingham Palace came down. The tributes began. Elizabeth II was 75 years old. She had been queen for 50 years. She had, for most of those 50 years, carried a private financial responsibility for her mother's lifestyle that had required a careful, sustained management. The 1994 trust, the ongoing subsidy the FT described as simple historical fact, the structural architecture built to ensure that the eventual reckoning could be absorbed without scandal. The reckoning had now arrived. The 1994 trust structure absorbed the Coutts overdraft through the estate's asset base. Sir Michael Peet prepared and delivered his public statement. Taxpayers bore no direct liability. The estate, the artworks, the furniture, the personal possessions accumulated across a century of collecting, the contents of Clarence House, Burke Hall, Royal Lodge, and the Castle of May, was formally transferred. The official royal family statement, published on May 17, 2002, was explicit. Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, has bequeathed her entire estate, which mainly comprises the contents of her houses, to the Queen. Every residual asset, every outstanding obligation, everything. Clarence House was next. Shortly after the Queen Mother's death, the London residence transferred to Prince Charles. He moved in, refurbished it according to his own preferences, and made it his primary London address, a 4-minute walk from Buckingham Palace, as Penny Junor noted in The Firm. The house that had been the Queen Mother's home, her social headquarters, the venue for 50 years of champagne and horses and Dubonnet, and elaborate entertaining, became something else. The guests changed. The catering arrangements changed. The Dubonnet was presumably no longer in the decanter. The Guardian ran a piece on April 3, 2002, 3 days after the death, headlined, "The Gamble That Foiled the Taxman." Its subject was the financial structure around the estate, specifically the observation that the Queen Mother's extraordinary longevity had cost the exchequer millions in inheritance tax revenue that would otherwise have accrued if she had died earlier, before certain asset protections had been put in place. Even that angle, The tax angle was handled gently in the coverage of those weeks. The estate arrangements were reported as complex, as having been carefully managed, as having resulted in a broadly clean outcome. The fuller accounting, the decades of overspending, the sustained subsidy, the overdraft that had been visible in a BBC Business article 18 months before her death, didn't become the dominant narrative. The dominant narrative was the wave, the hats, the pearls, the smile, the blitz, the century of service. That was the Queen Mother that April. That is largely still the Queen Mother now. What the private financial record shows, when you follow it systematically from 1952 to 2002, is something quite specific. It shows a woman who decided in February 1952 that her status had not fundamentally changed, and who spent the next 50 years making sure that decision held. It shows a parliamentary annuity that Parliament raised 9 times the original figure over 4 decades, while still proving insufficient. It shows a Coutts overdraft that was visible to journalists writing about banking governance in November 2000. It shows a trust fund constructed in 1994 because the people managing these affairs understood that without it, the eventual debt settlement would be impossible to absorb quietly. It shows Sir Arthur Penn writing a begging letter to Buckingham Palace in 1959, 7 years into the arrangement, because the situation had already become serious enough to threaten public humiliation. And it shows Elizabeth II, described by the Financial Times as having subsidized her mother, described by every subsequent account as having been the person who cleared the final overdraft, absorbing the cost of all of it, continuously, for half a century. None of the documentary record suggests Elizabeth complained. There is no published account of her expressing frustration to courtiers. No private letter surfaces in any biography showing resentment of the arrangement. The institutional interest of the monarchy required the Queen Mother's image to remain intact. A publicly known multi-million-pound overdraft, held by a woman simultaneously receiving a parliamentary annuity raised by Parliament to £643,000 a year, would have been politically and reputationally damaging to an institution that was asking the public to accept its continued existence as a reasonable use of national resources. So the subsidy continued inside the palace's financial structure, quietly, for decades. The Queen Mother spent her entire adult life doing exactly as she wished. She drank the Dubonnet at noon and the champagne at dinner. She watched her 400 winners cross the finish line across 5 decades of racing. She entertained at Clarence House and stayed at Burke Hall and tended the garden at the Castle of May. She waved from the balcony in the hat and the pearls and the white gloves and the pastel coat, and the crowds roared, and she smiled as if all of this were the most natural thing in the world. It cost millions of pounds that she didn't have. It was absorbed by a structure that her daughter maintained, at private expense, across 50 years of quiet, dutiful, entirely unreported financial management. When the full bill finally arrived, in the spring of 2002, in the form of a sealed Coutts account, an estate to administer, and a daughter who was simultaneously grieving and governing, it landed precisely where it had always been heading, on Elizabeth. If you found this story worth your time, subscribing to the channel means you won't miss the next one.